We have a fantastic session ahead of us, three somehow tight papers, and without much ado, we'll move to our first speaker, Professor Maren Niehoff, who is the Max Cooper Professor of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University and member of the Academy. She's most known for her work on Philo of Alexandria, and her recent intellectual biography of Philo was published by Yale University Press in 2018. Another field of interest of her is the encounter between Rabbinic literature and Greco-Roman culture, especially in Caesarea. And she's going to talk to us today about Caesarea as a magnet of mobility and migration among Jews, Christians, and pagans. Maren, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Itzik. As the title of my lecture suggests, I will argue today that Caesarea was a remarkably attractive city in the 3rd century and prompted an influx of Christians, pagans, and Jews. Some came for meaningful visits, while others stayed and substantially changed the city's atmosphere. I seek to document these changes and to examine their nature and circumstances. Why, in other words, did Caesarea become a magnet of mobility and migration, particularly in the 3rd century? Did the new waves of visitors and immigrants differ from earlier ones? Furthermore, are there any connections between the patterns of mobility and migration among Christians, pagans, and Jews? I hope to show that the immigrants and visitors of the 3rd century were far more intellectual than their predecessors and turned Caesarea into a hub of philosophy and Bible exegesis. More specifically, Origen's rather more accidental choice to settle in Caesarea was the key to these developments, prompting pagan and Jewish intellectuals to flock into the city and to establish themselves there. And the rabbinic study house set up by Rabbi Hoshaya in Caesarea may have been part of this overall movement. Let me start my lecture by framing the question of Caesarea's special attractiveness in the 3rd century by evidence from the 1st and 2nd centuries. Josephus is our main witness. He describes Herod's magnificent refoundation of Strato's Tower of Caesarea, a city dedicated to Augustus. Subsequent developments in his reports about the city mainly concern political and religious matters. Caesarea emerges as a provincial capital, which typically negotiates between the empire and different local populations. Politicians, competitors in athletic and artistic competitions, as well as heads of communities and soldiers play a visible role, while no scholars or philosophers are mentioned. And now I'm going to run through very fast the first 5 handouts on your, 5 sources on your handout, and don't worry, I won't read them out, but they are just to give you a context to compare the 3rd century. So Caesarea is introduced already in the Jewish War as a Herodian foundation with magnificent buildings. Especially noteworthy is the harbor with Caesar's temple, remarkable for its beauty and grand proportions, as well as the city's statues with white stone buildings and its design of converging streets with equal distances. Herod entertains Marcus Agrippa, the close friend and son-in-law of Augustus, diverting him and his friends with enjoyable food and luxury in Caesarea. Sportive and artistic competitions are moreover inaugurated by Herod. He had, again on your handout, announced a contest in music and athletic exercises and prepared a great number of gladiators and wild beasts and also horse races and the very lavish shows that can be seen in Rome and in various other places. According to Josephus, Augustus and his wife Julia lavishly supported these games so that a great crowd flocked to the city for the spectacle, as well as envoys which the community sent because of the benefits they had received. The athletic games in Caesarea continued to flourish after Herod's death, as attested by inscriptions from Aphrodisias and Laodicea, which I have discussed elsewhere. Caesarea thus emerges in Josephus' report, Herodian Caesarea, as a city in grand style with strong Roman orientation, which prompts short visits of Roman officials and participants in various competitions. Caesarea later became the seat of the Roman governor, to whom Jews turned in times of trouble. Pilate is approached by a Jewish delegation, pleading him to remove the effigies of Caesar, which he had introduced by night to Jerusalem. Josephus, moreover, describes in detail a conflict in 59-60. Based on Herod's foundation, the Jews of Caesarea claim the city for themselves, while the Syrians insist that the city belongs to the Greeks. Josephus characterizes the Jews as superior in wealth and physical strength, somaton alke. When the Greeks obtain authority over the city through Nero's intervention, war is sparked by a well-known incident at the synagogue, which is situated next to the property of a provocative Greek who not only obstructs the entrance, the entry into the building, but also sets up a bird sacrifice just in front of it. In this context, too, the Jews are described as being rich. They can offer an extraordinary price for the Greek plot, and when violence erupts, the Jewish notables, with John the tax collector, offered the Roman governor Florus 8 talents of silver for stopping the provocative activities of their neighbor. Josephus also refers to Jews of equestrian rank, when men who, if Jews by birth, were indeed invested with that Roman dignity. In post-Herodian Caesarea, the wealth of the Jewish population and its integration into Roman hierarchies are conspicuous. John the tax collector may remind you of Alexander the Alabarch, who had a similar job in Egypt and enjoyed excellent connections with the imperial family. Significant, there is no parallel at that time in Caesarea for Philo, his brother, the famous philosopher and exegete. Josephus' reports about Caesarea end with the disastrous consequences of the massacre. In his words, the Syrians slaughtered more than 1,000 Jews within 1 hour, and Caesarea was completely emptied, kenothenai, of Jews. Tanitic literature, namely Rabbinic literature reflecting on the 1st and 2nd century, conveys the sense that Caesarea was considered impure territory because of its overwhelmingly non-Jewish population. Yehuda, the baker, testifies that the eastern portico is pure, while the rest of the city is impure because it is land of the nations, mishum eretz ha'amim. The Tosefta, moreover, stresses that the etrog of Caesarea is assumed to be pure, implying that other products were not. The Jerusalem Talmud also knows about the annulation of this impurity and debates who was responsible for permitting the city, Hetir. Either Rabbi, the redactor of the Mishnah, or Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel before him. For the former, the legitimization of Caesarea parallels that of Beit She'an and Beit Guvrin. Following this brief survey of Caesarea from its foundation by Herod onwards, we are now in a position to appreciate the role of the city in the 3rd century, when it quite suddenly emerges in the sources as a hub of intellectual life and a hotspot of broader scholarly networks. The different religious communities are usually interpreted in isolation. Joseph Patrick, for example, notes, and I quote, the renewal and establishment of a new Jewish community in the city under the leadership of Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Abahu, and depicts the Christian community as an independent entity next to it. Again, I'm quoting, at the same time, the Christian community became firmly established. It was well known for its library and academy under the leadership of Origin and afterwards Pamphilus. My reading of the sources suggests a slightly different scenario. Juxtaposing all the available evidence from the different religious communities, I suggest that we start with Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, the only source providing a chronological framework and also an explanation for migration to Caesarea in the early 3rd century. I refer, of course, to Eusebius's description of Origen's migration from Alexandria to Caesarea, which reads a bit like a Joseph story of envy, human envy and competition. The circumstances of Origen's migration are reported on different occasions in Eusebius's history, each giving different weight either to the deterring force of Demetrius, bishop of Alexandria, or the pulling agency of Theoktistos, bishop of Caesarea. The most detailed, yet also most apologetic account is text, I think it's 10 on your handout. And it's the longest one, easy to find in any case. At that time, while Origen was performing the work of instruction at Alexandria, he did a thing that gave abundant proof of an immature and youthful mind, and yet also of faith and self-control. For he took the saying, "There are eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven," in too literal and extreme a sense. He thought both to fulfill the Savior's saying and also to prevent all suspicion of shameful slander on the part of unbelievers, seeing that he, as a young man, used to discuss divine things, not only with men, but also with women. He thus hastened to put into effect the Savior's saying, taking care to escape the notice of most of the students around him. Demetrius certainly knew about it later, insofar as he was presiding over the community in that place. And while he exceedingly marveled at him for his bold act, he approved the zeal and the sincerity of his faith. He bade him to be of good cheer and now urged him on to devote himself even more to the work of instruction. Such indeed was his attitude at that time. But not long afterwards, then the same person saw that he, Origen, was prospering and a great man and distinguished and famous in the sight of all. Overcome by human weakness, he attempted to describe the deed as a most bizarre to the bishops throughout the world. When the most highly approved and distinguished bishops of Palestine, namely those of Caesarea and Jerusalem, deemed Origen worthy of the highest honor and laid hands on him for the purpose of the presbyterate. While he then had advanced to a position of great esteem and acquired no small reputation and fame for his virtue and wisdom in the eyes of all men everywhere, Demetrius, who found no other fault, made a vicious fuss about the deed committed long ago when still a boy, and dared to include in his accusations those who raised him to the presbyterate, namely those two bishops, the Caesarean and the Jerusalemite. This account of Eusebius highlights Demetrius's envy of Origen, which is camouflaged by the reproach of his self-castration. The framework of this lecture does not permit me to address the much debated question whether Origen really castrated himself, as I think he did, together with Joseph Trigg, for example. In the present context, I rather wish to draw attention to the fact that Eusebius does not explicitly identify Demetrius's envy as the direct cause of Origen's departure. He instead distinguishes between two stages of Origen's activity, namely his initial teaching in Alexandria and his later fame, presumably, even not explicitly said so, accumulated in Caesarea. And it seems that the latter prompted Demetrius's envy and insincere accusations. Caesarea is assumed, but not explicitly mentioned. The next text on your handout offers a different scenario for Origen's emigration from Alexandria. And the text runs as follows. But after a lapse of time, no small warfare broke out, polemos, in the city, and Origen fled from Alexandria and went to Palestine, sojourning in Caesarea. And here the bishops requested him to discuss and interpret the Holy Scriptures publicly in church, even though he had not yet obtained the ordination of the presbyterate. It is clear that this was so from the letters of Alexander, the bishop of Jerusalem, and Theoctistus, bishop of Caesarea. The war which causes Origen's departure from Alexandria remains surprisingly enigmatic. H.J. Lawler, the editor and English translator of Eusebius' text, suggests that this is a reference, no doubt, to the massacre of the inhabitants of Alexandria by Caracalla in 215 CE. But how certain is this historical framework, given that Origen finally left for Caesarea only in 232, as emerges from other passages? Why does Eusebius remain so unspecific? May he have wished to explain Origen's otherwise puzzling departure from Alexandria, apparently without Demetrius' knowledge and consent? And thus also Lawler's translation that he secretly left Alexandria doesn't quite fit the context of the war, but perhaps is really significant in pointing to the problem that Origen may have left without notifying Demetrius, and thus a reason had to be provided. The ambitious young man, Origen, may have gone where better career opportunities offered themselves, and the best offer seems to have come from Caesarea. This impression is strengthened by Eusebius' report of Origen's ordination in Caesarea in another passage, number 12. This time it is placed in the context of an urgent journey to Greece, which allegedly leads Origen en route to Palaestina, even though the direct sea route seems to have been far more natural. The choice of Caesarea rather than Jerusalem is not explained. The reference to bishops in the plural, however, implies that Alexander, the bishop of Jerusalem, was also involved. Eusebius' emphasis on a pressing necessity in church matters as a justification of Origen's journey may again cover more personal reasons, such as his hope of being ordained as a presbyter. And significantly, Eusebius' last description of Origen's move to Caesarea, number 13, simply speaks about his migration, metanastasis, in the 10th year of Marcus Aurelius' reign, namely in 232 CE. Eusebius' different descriptions of Origen's migration from Alexandria to Caesarea thus suggest highly personal reasons, which seem to have little to do with the specific features of Caesarea. It is simply the sympathy of the local bishop that draws him there. Interestingly, nothing else is known about Theoctistus except that he supported Origen. The move to Caesarea looks like a career choice which opened new avenues of activity in a church not available in Alexandria under Demetrius. In a way, it is precisely the relative marginality of Caesarea in comparison to Alexandria which may have been attractive because it held numerous options of activity. Once settled in Caesarea, Origen quickly gains such fame that he becomes a magnet for other visitors and immigrants. The rest of my lecture today documents the effects of his move to Caesarea and argues that it prompted a significant influx, not only on the part of Christians, but also of pagans and even of Jews. Eusebius is once more our prime source. He makes large claims about Origen's attraction among the learned, for example, text number 14. And many other cultured persons, since Origen's fame was noised about everywhere, came to him to make trial of the man's sufficiency in the sacred books. Who were these learned men who were drawn to by Origen to Caesarea? Initially, Christians naturally figure prominently. Firmilian, bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, sometimes, so Eusebius tells us, summoned Origen for consultations, but occasionally also journeyed himself to Judea and, to quote, spent some time with him for his own betterment in divine things. A critical reader of Eusebius will, of course, suspect that he hugely exaggerated Origen's importance for apologetic reasons. For the Christian side, however, we have independent evidence, which, to some extent, at least confirms Eusebius' story. I refer, of course, to the encomium of Origen written by an anonymous student traditionally identified as Gregory Thaumaturgos. While this ascription to Gregory Thaumaturgos has long been rejected by Gilles Dorival and others, the text itself remains a precious testimony to Origen's attraction among Christians. The anonymous author of the encomium describes his Christian way of life from his early youth onwards, namely after his father passed away. His arrival in Caesarea was rather more accidental, as he originally aimed at Beirut for law studies. He only passed through Caesarea to accompany his sister on the way to join her husband, a legal advisor of the Roman governor. In this case, too, Caesarea emerges as a comparatively marginal city, namely in comparison to Beirut. The anonymous author of the encomium, however, meets an outstanding intellectual, Origen, and is captivated by his personality there and decides to stay for several years. What about pagans and Jews? Did they respond to Origen's arrival in Caesarea? Porphyry, the Neoplatonist, seems to have checked out Origen in his youth. And this is the text from the 619, 1-3, text 16. Now, as witnesses also to his achievements, Origen's, of course, in this direction, we have the Greek philosophers themselves who flourished in his day, in whose treatises we find frequent mention of the man. Sometimes they would dedicate their books to him, sometimes submit their own labors to him for judgment as to a master. But why need one say this when even Porphyry, who settled in our day in Sicily, issued treatises against us, the Contra Christianos, attempting in them to slander the sacred scriptures and mention those who had given their interpretation of them. And since he could not by any means bring in any case charge against our opinions, for lack of argument he turned to deride and slander their interpreters also, and among them Origen especially. He said that in his early manhood he had known him. Eusebius' praise of Origen as a master of pagan philosophers should not be taken too seriously. But the most crucial point of this passage, namely Porphyry's visit, does demand our serious attention. And it does receive a confirmation from a fragment of Porphyry himself, also transmitted by Eusebius. And here we have now a quotation from Porphyry himself. Then, after some other remarks, Porphyry says, "But this kind of absurdity, namely interpreting the New Testament as allegorically anticipated by the Old Testament, derives from a man whom I encountered when I was still very young, who enjoyed a great reputation and still holds it because of the writings he has left behind. I mean Origen, whose fame has been widespread among the teachers of this kind of learning. For this man was a student of Ammonius, who had the greatest proficiency in philosophy in our day. And so far as a grasp of knowledge was concerned, he owed much to his master. But as regards the right choice of life, he took the opposite road to him." To be sure, this fragment does not explicitly refer to Caesarea, but nevertheless, I would argue, provides strong circumstantial evidence for Porphyry's encounter with Origen in that city, which was, of course, very close to his hometown, Tyre. Several scholars have remarked that the verb entynchanein is too casual to refer to a serious encounter, let alone studies at Origen's school. Johnson, for example, interprets as a reference to reading, namely that Porphyry simply read Origen's book. But Beatrice, I think, rightly argued that in such a case one would have expected a book as an object of the verb, and not the reference to Origin as a person. Nevertheless, we have to note that Porphyry immediately afterwards speaks of Origin as a student and hearer, akroates, of Ammonius, using a clear technical term. This may imply that Porphyry's description of his own relationship with Origin was of a different and far less institutionalized kind. However, the rhetorical context of Porphyry's remark also needs to be considered. Since he wrote the above lines much later in his Contra Christianos, he had good reasons not to highlight and perhaps even to downplay his stay in Caesarea with Origin. Origin was dead by now, as Porphyry indicates, but his reputation was still significant. Origin was the central target, at least of Book 3 of Porphyry's Contra Christianos, perhaps even the springboard for the whole book. As Porphyry explains in the subsequent lines of the fragment, he accused Origin of lapsing into barbarian ways and abusing his Greek paideia for unworthy Christian hermeneutics. These snippets of information indicate that Porphyry got to know Origin and his work well enough to make him the special target of his work, or parts of his work, against Christianity. This anti-Originian orientation of Porphyry's work makes best sense in the context of his initial stay in Caesarea and his disillusionment with a man whom he expected to be a Greek philosopher, an impressive Greek philosopher. Two further sentences in Eusebius's account strengthen the impression that Porphyry had come to study or to encounter Origin in Caesarea. Eusebius himself paraphrases Porphyry's account in a way that gives more weight to a close encounter. Porphyry, Eusebius says that he knew him in his early manhood, egnokenai phesas. The verb gignoskein, by comparison to entuchanein, implies a deeper level of familiarity and understanding. Rufinus uses the verb vidi, I saw, in his Latin translation of Eusebius, so conveying a similar sense of an encounter. Moreover, Porphyry's fragment appears in the context of Origen's reflections on contacts with heretics and men of Greek learning, especially Greek philosophers who came to see him, pros eesan, and engaged in debates with him. Since this recollection is mentioned immediately after Porphyry's autobiographical report about his own encounter with Origin, Porphyry is implied by Eusebius to be among the pagan philosophers coming to Caesarea. Porphyry's stay with Origin, however, did not lead to his conversion, as the 5th century historian Socrates of Constantinople imagined, and some modern scholars, I'm afraid, have followed him in assuming this. On the contrary, his stay in Caesarea prompted disillusionment and criticism of Christianity. The first seeds of his Contra Christianos may well have developed in Caesarea, perhaps encouraged by additional sources of inspiration there, such as the books of Josephus in the library, Africanus's letter about the book of Daniel, and perhaps even the Greek-speaking Jews of the city. And now I come to my final point. Did the Jews take any notice of Origen's arrival in Caesarea? I think they did, as would be most likely and natural given this whole business about Origin and people arriving. Let me start with a snippet of information from Eusebius again. He says, "Now while Origin was plying his accustomed task at Caesarea, many came to him, not only of the natives, umonoton epichorion, but also numbers of foreign pupils who had left their home countries. Who may these locals have been? Could they have included Jews? Wilhelm Bacher, the great scholar of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, has long ago alerted us to the contacts between Origin and Rabbi Hoshaya of Caesarea. As he put it, Origin lived in Caesarea in the 4th and 5th decade of the 3rd century. In the assumption that he had contacts with Hoshaya suggests itself. Perhaps the learned bishop so Bacher mistakenly writes, the famous representative of the allegorical approach to the scriptures is to be identified with the philosopher, philosophos, and this is the last passage on your handout, who asked Hoshea a question, why God, if circumcision is so precious, did not give it to the first human being. Now, as you will immediately realize if you look at that passage in Genesis Rabbah, it's a philosopher who is interested in the Bible and in circumcision, so it's not a normal pagan philosopher, but most likely a Christian philosopher of the kind of Origin, who has a very long sermon kind of against literal circumcision. So I would like to add to this fundamental insight of Bacher regarding contacts between the rabbi and the church father, that the nomenclature of philosophos in the Hebrew is not only a transliteration of the Greek term, of course, but also resonates well with Porphyry's encounter of Origin as a philosopher. I am suggesting, in other words, that Hoshea's conversation with Origin may have followed a similar pattern and may also have led to similar conclusions. The rabbi, too, remained unconvinced by Origen's biblical exegesis and offered his own counter-interpretations. To conclude, I hope to have shown that Caesarea began to flourish in the early 3rd century as an intellectual center of a new dimension. The beginning of this development was marked by Origen's rather accidental arrival, motivated by personal ambitions, which could more easily be realized in a more marginal place than Alexandria. Once settled in his new home, however, and lavishly supported by a whole team of writers and stenographers financed by Ambrose, Origen turned Caesarea into a hub of intellectual encounters. People began to arrive and spend time there for his sake. Not only Christians, but also prominent pagans and Jews, such as Porphyry and Hoshea, engaged with him. If my analysis is correct, Origen was perceived by such non-Christians as a philosopher dealing with the scriptures. He may well have served as a conduit of Greek paideia in Caesarea. And we may even have to look, or should look, at Hoshea's commentary on the book of Genesis, which often responds to Christian ideas, as I have shown on other occasions, in light of Porphyry's Contra Christianos. The hermeneutics of the pagan and the Jewish intellectual, who both encountered Origen, deserve to be studied in view of each other. Moreover, the school or Beit Midrash, which Hoshea set up in Caesarea, may well have responded to Origen's school, the foundation of which we can date to 232. The mobility of Christians, pagans, and Jews was thus not only directly connected to each other, but also seems to have stimulated significant intellectual migrations. Thank you.
Thank you, Maren, for a fantastic, thought-provoking paper. I'm sure there are some questions. Please, Simon.
Thanks, Maren. The word I didn't hear you say, though I might have missed it, was Neoplatonism.
Pardon?
Was Neoplatonism. And I wonder how important do you think, I've got two questions here. One of them is how important do you think Origen is for a genuine shift in the language of Christianity? You say a philosophos being treated in that way. But of course, he's a very ambivalent figure for later Christians too. I mean, often accused of being a heretic in this way. And it's primarily because of the way he's connected to someone like Porphyry. And, you know, if one reads Synesius or someone like that, one can see immediately how important that philosophical tradition becomes after Origen. So the question really is more how dangerous was Origen rather than how attractive was he? That's the first question. And the second question is what happens a bit later and how that might reflect the tradition back on the tradition, which is the formation of the library, and then Jerome making a trip to Oregon, and Jerome making Oregon a big figure in his history. Does that get reflected back for you in a way that we can now tell the history of Oregon in a more positive way? So the two questions are linked. I mean, is he actually more negative at the start and becomes more positive after Jerome in terms of the way we understand Oregon?
So I will leave the question regarding Jerome to Oz, who will speak after me on Jerome. Oh.
On your desk.
Yeah.
Press the red button.
Oh.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So I will leave the question about Jerome to Oz, who will speak right after me. If I understood the questions correctly, so Origen as a philosopher, I, of course, always evaluate his philosophical engagements in comparison to Philo, and it's very clear that his engagement with Platonic philosophy is far more superficial than Philo's. I mean, he never quotes Plato. He never kind of really engages with the details. It's kind of much more kind of a general knowledge of Platonism, which of course is very important to him, but he doesn't have the depth of analyzing a particular text of Plato. And of course we have his great Contra Celsum, where he actually opposes a Platonic, very outspoken Platonic critic of Christianity, and he time and again explains how Christianity is superior to the Platonic heritage. So I think Origen is, and if we compare him also to Clement of Alexandria, I think Clement had a much more profound immersion in the philosophical in pagan traditions, and I think he was also more enthusiastic about it. So Origen is always a bit ambivalent, and he does kind of present himself and understand himself as a philosopher, but kind of to a limited extent, I think, in comparison to others. Now, the second question is, of course, very important, because much of my argument relies on Eusebius, right? And there, of course, you can rightly ask, well, what happened between Origen and Eusebius? And perhaps Eusebius makes all this up for his own apologetic purposes in the fight over Origen, when he actually comes together with Pamphilus to defend Origen. So whatever he can say about Origen has to be taken very cautiously, obviously. Now, I do take the fragments that we have from Porphyry himself as fragments, and there are general, I mean, and this is, I mean, in the latest edition of the fragments by Matthias Becker, I mean, these fragments are also taken as authentic fragments. So we do get, if we take that fragment as an authentic fragment, then we do have actually a confirmation of what Eusebius has just said beforehand. And it seems to me, and we also, of course, have the encomium of Origen, which is another external evidence for Christian attraction to Origen. And I think we can kind of distinguish very clearly between the rather clear language of Eusebius concerning all these networkings that he drew to Caesarea, where he is very precise and gives us names and circumstances, and he doesn't kind of build it up too much, with the very apologetic report of his departure from Alexandria. Because there we get 4 different reports, some kind of completely blown up and with the castration story inserted. And there you can, from the style of Eusebius, you get a very clear sense that he is hiding something, and that he's kind of talking around the bush, and it's very clear that you have to read it kind of against his rhetoric. But with these other parts where he's very factual, kind of to the point with details, and it's supported by at least 2 external sources, I think we can be pretty sure that there must have been something about it. And perhaps my last point would also be, in a way, we can perhaps even take Hoshea as evidence for this, because Hoshea is responding to Christian ideas, whereas Abahu, who comes a little bit later, is not responding anymore to Christian ideas. That's not, it doesn't seem to be high on his agenda. And Abahu already is kind of after Origin. So it makes sense that the rabbi who is kind of working next to Origin in Caesarea responds to him, and the rabbi following him doesn't seem to be very concerned about Christianity anymore. So I think that's another kind of correlation of that point.
Any other question? Please.
Thank you for your inspiring paper. I wonder whether one could make your approach still more radical. You showed that Christians, Jews, and pagans shared common interests, and doing so we still use a religious language, although it's clear that the religious identity is only one of multiple identities, to put it this way in the sense of Rebellion, whereas education is another one. And pagans don't even have a pagan identity because they are defined as pagans by the other ones. And so, should we perhaps turn the things in a way and start with a distinction between apopaideas and apopaideas, epichoreoi, kai, tes adodapes, these distinctions, and then add, they happen to be Christians and Jews, and non-Christian, non-Jews as well, in order to get a better impression of the kind of third space or neutralized space which existed in this field of education, which allowed it that a Christian who, for accidental circumstances, came to Caesarea, made Caesarea a hub of intellectual interests.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, so I think in the paper the philosophos is the kind of the third, the kind of neutral territory that I kind of used. I would be a bit hesitant to declare this as a kind of a permanent or kind of a permanent kind of third space, because if my reading is correct, then Porphyry quite quickly became disappointed, and Hoshea responded critically to Origen's question. So it seems that there may have been kind of moments when everybody thought, oh, we're all in the same boat, we're all philosophers, and then some people thought that this was a permanent kind of position, and others responded in different ways. And concerning your point, I think it's also very important that in the encomium, the encyclica, the general studies get quite a prominent point in the description. So here again, we have somebody who comes as a Christian and is really enthusiastic about Origin, but one of the first things that he points out is this encyclical general education, and that's kind of really interesting, that's one of the main points at the beginning about the teaching curriculum for Origin. So, and here, of course, you also wonder how much that reflects Origen's own self-perception, right? That's actually what he was doing. And here also my question comes in when I said that perhaps Origin may also have been a conduit for Greek learning. That comes exactly in this on this point, when suddenly you have in Caesarea, you have this, this much Greek learning, and the encyclica are studied. And so this surely must have had an impact. So I would agree to it, but I would see it as a kind of a very dynamic, not a static entity, but a kind of a dynamic possibility that is all the time entertained, in fact. And I guess we can also see it on the part of Origin, when time and again he turns to Jews, and sometimes he seems to have sometimes he turns to them for Hebrew expertise, and at other times he turns to them because he thinks that they have actually common grounds, and certainly common grounds against Celsus. And so then, but we don't have the Jewish side, whether they also thought that they have common grounds with Origin against. So, but there are always these hopes that there are common grounds with at least parts of the other groups. And I think that was actually a very important part of those discussions. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ready for Jerome.
Yes, we are ready for Jerome. So.